this is the story of the leaf-loving liquidator Matthew Hoffman. The only survivor of this crime was a child, so we will be referring to her as Jane and omitting a few details to protect her identity. Okay, so in November of 2018, Tina Herman didn't show up for her shift at work. Her boss was a little worried, so he decided to go out to her house to check on her. When he got there, he immediately knew something had gone terribly wrong, so he called the police. He said her place looked like a scene out of a horror movie. When the police got there, they started to get concerned because they couldn't find Tina anywhere. There was also no trace of Tina's son Cody, her 13-year-old daughter Jane, or her neighbor Stephanie, whose car was left empty in the driveway. Shortly after the officials' discovery, or lack thereof, a massive search began. The whole town was out looking for Tina and her crew on foot and by car. They were taping up flyers around the city, posting about the missing group on Facebook, and bringing up the situation to any and everyone they talked to. Like, no one could understand what was going on. They didn't know if the four were still alive or who could have possibly taken them. The next day, Tina's truck was found abandoned at the nearby college campus. The entire school went on a lockdown, which was a huge deal because no one knew if this dangerous person could be nearby, just waiting to attack someone else. The police questioned everyone in the immediate area, but couldn't really find anyone who was acting super sus or out of the ordinary. Investigators got their first lead as they're going over to the crime scene. They discovered a Walmart bag with a receipt in it that was for a heavy-duty tarp and a ton of those 55-gallon garbage bags. So the police took the receipt and went to Walmart, where they asked if they could look at the surveillance footage to try to spot whoever bought the items on the receipt. And sure enough, up walks this young 30-something-year-old guy who purchases these items. He was thin and scraggly looking with brown hair, and as soon as the cops spotted him in the footage, they were like, "That's our guy." In the videos, investigators saw their guy leave the store, get into his silver Toyota Yaris, and drive away. Anywho, so the police went to the DMV and got the records of every silver Yaris owner in the area, and up pops this guy named Matthew Hoffman. So Matthew Hoffman is a 30-year-old unemployed tree trimmer who also spent a little time in jail for arson. When one of the officers saw the picture of Matthew, he suddenly remembered that he talked to that guy up at the college when they were going around questioning people about Tina's truck. And that's when he remembered something else. Matthew said he was waiting to pick up his girlfriend from work, and when the cop asked him what his girlfriend's name was, he responded, Jane. Investigators got Matthew's address, assembled the troops, and prepared for just about anything. They didn't know if Matthew will be waiting for them, if he has any accomplices, or if anyone is even alive in there. All they know is Matthew is dangerous. So the cops called in the SWAT team to join them in searching Matthew's house. When they busted in the door, they found Matthew Hoffman sleeping like a log on the couch. And they also found the entire living room filled with leaves. Investigators walked down the hall to the bathroom and found hundreds of plastic shopping bags lining the walls. Every single one of them was packed to the brim with, you guessed it, leaves. The bags of leaves almost looked like insulation because they were meticulously lined up along the wall to cover every inch. So after their whole leaf-coated wall discovery, investigators went down into the basement and tried to get in, but the door was barricaded shut with a sewing machine. Well, despite Matthew's weird attempt to block the door, the cops were able to get it open. And as soon as they did, they found Tina's 13-year-old daughter, Jane, bound and gagged, laying on a big bed of leaves. She was still alive, too. Matthew was immediately arrested, and while the investigators were ecstatic that they were able to find Jane alive, they were also concerned over the fact that they had 3 other missing people. So they knew they had to act fast. But this case was about to go from disturbing to infuriating because as soon as they entered the house, Matthew just stopped talking. During his marathon interview session, he just sat there, slumped over, ignoring questions for hours on end. Eventually, after the investigators' many attempts at getting him to talk in custody, Matthew spilled the tea leaves and claimed the entire thing was just a burglary gone wrong. He said that he never planned to whack anyone and was only planning to rob the house when he was surprised by the family coming home and he panicked. He also claimed that he picked the house at random simply because it was isolated enough and he could watch from across the street in the woods. So the night Matthew broke in, he said he went out into the woods with his sleeping bag and watched the house before eventually falling asleep. When he woke up the next morning, he watched everyone leave the house, then casually walked over and crawled under the overhead garage door, which hadn't shut all the way, giving him super easy access to the house. He said his intent was only to steal and was just excited at the thought of being in someone else's house alone. He also told officials that he had only been in the home for an hour tops when Tina and her neighbor Stephanie surprised him by coming home. At the time, Matthew had this intense serrated hunting blade thingy on him, which he said he only had brought in case he needed it, but wasn't planning on using it. So Matthew panicked and immediately started attacking the women and was slashing them until he was sure they were gone. After that, he kind of just wandered the house in a state of shock, taking in what he had done. He then realized he needed to dispose of the bodies somehow and began what he called processing them in the bathtub. As he was finishing up, Matthew said Cody and Jane came home from school and surprised him again. Matthew recounted that Jane screamed and ran into her room to hide, but little 11-year-old Cody wasn't as lucky because he didn't even make it in the front door. After Matthew finished with Cody, he went into Jane's room. She was sitting there covering her eyes, and Matthew said he just couldn't bring himself to finish the job. So instead, he tied her up with an electrical cord and took her with him. Matthew then left the house in Stephanie's Jeep with all 3 corpses and a tied-up Jane loaded in the car. Despite the fact that he told these gruesome details to investigators, it's clear to them immediately that Matthew overall thought himself to be a nice guy the entire time he had Jane with him. He said he let her play Wii video games, watch Iron Man 1 and 2, and he even cooked her hamburgers and slept with his arm around her each night. He also showed her the definition of the word ransom in the dictionary and explained to her that he and Jane's parents were negotiating on a price for her. He promised her she would be okay and said she would be home playing with her family by Christmas. Over the course of the 4 days, Matthew left Jane alone in his house and went to bury the bodies in the woods. He took several trips and several vehicles to dispose of the bodies, switching off from his Yaris, Tina's pickup truck, and Stephanie's Jeep. But the one thing he didn't count on was an investigation happening so soon. That night, he went to a bike trail near Kenyon College where he left Tina's pickup truck, planning to take the truck back to Tina's house and burn down the place. Like I mentioned earlier, he had spent 6 years in prison for an arson he had committed. He actually burglarized a different house a decade earlier and was obsessed with the idea of being caught by fingerprint evidence, which is why he burned the place down. So when Matthew rolled up to do the same thing to the Herman residence and saw the police, he tried to leave but was stopped by them. Officials questioned him and he lied, saying that he was picking up his girlfriend Jane from work. The cops continuously asked Matthew to tell them where the bodies were during his questioning, but he refused to tell them anything. Stephanie's sister Sherry even agreed to take capital punishment off the table if he told them where the bodies were, which is not an easy thing for a victim's grieving relative to do. Throughout this time, hundreds of searchers were combing through rural Knox County looking for the bodies. The 3 hadn't been seen since November 10th, and Matthew still wouldn't talk. On November 16th, he finally spoke to a special agent from the Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation off camera in a single-stall restroom. So Matthew told the agent that he wanted to tell the detectives what happened, but on his own terms. This was Matthew's grand plan. He would write down the locations of the bodies for a lawyer and try to escape, but the special agent would fire at him, knocking him out completely. And only after he passed away is when Matthew said the lawyer could tell the police where the bodies were. And yes, this was his own plan. Matthew said he couldn't live with what he'd done, and that if the agent didn't snuff him, he would just take his own life in jail. And the special agent was like, no, that is absolutely not happening. You need to tell us. And it only took 2 days for Matthew to cave and point officials in the direction of a 60-foot hollow tree in the Kokosing Wildlife Area where the bodies were. He also agreed to give a detailed confession. And finally, after 8 days of searching, the remains were located. During Matthew's trial, he remained completely emotionless as he answered yes to acknowledge his guilty pleas. He stuck to his story of the burglary gone wrong and pled guilty in a courtroom packed with relatives and friends of the victims. He was charged for the 3 slayings and the 1 abduction and was given concurrent life sentences with no chance of parole. Jane said in a statement read by the prosecutor, "This has changed my whole life and my family's life too." In the statement, she relayed memories of the victims and said she was no longer scared of Matthew. The prosecution ultimately believed his story of a burglary gone wrong, although some of the investigators argued they believed he had planned the slayings the entire time. This was theorized because Matthew purchased the blade, tarp, and trash bags days before the robbery, as well as some rubber gloves and duct tape on a separate occasion. Regardless of whether or not it was planned, he still received the maximum punishment and will spend the rest of his days thinking about what he did, and I think that's beautiful. Today, Matthew sits in prison where he belongs, wasting away like a bag of old leaves. To this day, Matthew has never once apologized or asked for forgiveness of his crimes. Jane lives with her dad and is back in school, and she continues to work with therapists to cope with her trauma and loss. Whew! I told you that was a heavy hitter. I'm just glad that Jane got justice and was able to see Matthew get put away forever. We'll see you guys next time.